So we talked a bit about, in the previous bit, we talked about Mordecai and his place in the kingdom, Haman and his aspirations for great influence, and how Ahasuerus was pretty much left to the whim of whoever was flattering him at the time. So Haman had this plan of getting great honor. He was tired of Mordecai not bowing down to him, not respecting him. And so he went into the king and he said, "O king, may you live forever. What would you do for the man who has to honor him, a man who has served you well? How would you honor him?" And the king thought, and he said, "Well, I think I'd put him on my horse and have someone go ahead of him through the streets and saying, 'This is how the king rewards those that serve him well.'" And Haman thought, "That's a good idea. That's really good." And so Haman went home that night and he was very, very happy. And the king was laying in bed that evening and he was having a hard time going to sleep. So he had someone bring to him the records of the history of the kings of Persia. Definitely a boring read. And as he was reading it, he came across the episode where Mordecai had actually saved Ahasuerus' life. And he realized he had never done anything to thank Mordecai for that. And so he thought, "Oh, I must do something." And then he thought, "Oh, look, Haman was already thinking that ahead of me. He was preparing me." So Haman came in the next morning. He said, "O king, may you live forever. Have you thought over what I said?" And the king said, "Oh, yes, yes." He said, "Go bring Mordecai to me." And Haman was thinking, "Aha, see, Mordecai is going to have to bow down to me. We're on the same page." And the king says, "Haman, put Mordecai on my horse. And you go before Mordecai through the streets and say, 'This is how the king honors those who serve him well.'" And here was poor Haman then having to actually do the opposite of what he expected. And he had to honor Mordecai in front of everyone. And he went home furious. And he told his wife, and she's like, "Oh, we've got to do something." And he said, "This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a gallows. And on that gallows, while all the rest of the Jews are being killed throughout the land of Persia, I'm going to hang Mordecai on that gallows." And so he built a gallows, and it was so high that anyone in the city could see the top of the gallows. And he thought, "This is it. This is what is happening." So Mordecai, he hears of what the plan was that Haman had for all the Jews in the nation. And he got word to Esther and said, "This is what the king has planned. All of your people, you are all going to be killed. You may be spared, but all the rest of the people are going to be killed. And maybe God has called you to this position for such a time as this." And she said, "Okay, have everyone fast, have everyone pray, because I can't go into the king's presence without him asking me." That was the law of the land. No one could go into the king's presence without him asking them to come. Otherwise, he could kill them. And so she went before the king. And she said, "O king, may you live forever." And he said, "What would you like, Esther?" And he held out his scepter so she could come near him. And she said, would you and Haman come to dinner at my rooms?" And he said, "Oh, yes, we'd love to." And Haman was very happy. And he's like, "Oh, look at this. The queen recognizes." Because Haman was not aware that Mordecai and Esther were related. And so she has them in for the dinner that evening. And the king said, what is on your mind, Queen Esther?" And she said, "There's been a law that's been passed that all my people will be killed." And he said, Who passed this law?" And she said, "You, O king." And he's like, "Oh." She said, we don't even know what to do. It's so horrible. All my people will be killed." And he said, well, who came up with this idea? And she said, "Haman." And the king left her chambers. He was furious. And Haman knew that there was death written on his face. And he falls on Esther and he says, "Please intercede to the king for me." And the king comes back into the queen's rooms and he sees Haman laying there on top of the queen. And he's thinking what any married man would think seeing that sort of situation. And he orders Haman to be killed. He says, "You know that gallows, that gallows that's built in his yard? Yeah, hang him on that gallows." And so Haman ended up being killed on the very gallows that he had built to hang Mordecai on. But we still have the problem, the Jews. They were all going to be killed. And Esther says, "What do we do, O king?" And he said, "Bring in Mordecai." So Mordecai comes into the presence, and the king said, "I can't change the law I made, but what I can do is I can amend it. The Jews can defend themselves. It's only one day that this is to happen, so they can defend themselves." And so Mordecai got the news throughout all the kingdom of Persia and said that the Jews could defend themselves. They didn't have to be killed. And so on that day, there was death because the enemies of the Jews came against them And there were many that were killed, but it was only because the Jews defended themselves. And then after that day, the king honored Mordecai, and he had Mordecai live in Haman's house. And Mordecai had the second greatest position in the land. And Mordecai was greatly honored among all the people in the land of Persia. And the king and Mordecai then made a decree that among all the Jews, that every year on that day, that they would celebrate Purim, a day when God rescued his people from extinction. And to this day, the Jews celebrate Purim. And one of the things they do is they make these cookies. They're called hemaniers. And they eat these cookies. And then they read the story of Esther out loud. And whenever Mordecai is mentioned, all the people cheer. And whenever Haman is mentioned, all the people boo and they throw shoes. And to this day, that is how they celebrate Purim. And Purim is not a sacred feast day, but is a day of rejoicing where they are encouraged to eat and drink and be merry and to remember God's deliverance for them. And I was talking with a friend of mine, and he said during World War II, when the Jews were being severely persecuted, the book of Esther was great comfort to them because they saw that a nation and a leader wanted to eliminate them as a people, just as they were suffering under Hitler's regime, and he wanted to eliminate them as a people. So though the book of Esther never mentions God's name once, his presence is solid throughout it, and it brings great comfort to the people of God that are facing suffering and facing persecution, that God is there in the middle of it, even when they sometimes don't see him. So I hope you have a great time with this book. Enjoy it and rejoice in God's deliverance of his people in the midst of persecution.